When we think of the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, we tend to think of the early Viking raids and the later huge battles fought between them in England. But we don't really tend to think of how they both viewed money and the economy, which is something that isn't really covered much here on YouTube or in the popular imagination, but it's something I would like to look at today. Quick disclaimer before I do that is that this video is part of Vikings Month, which is a collaboration between several history channels including History Time, as well as the History of Vikings podcast, both of whom I've worked with on videos before, so highly recommend that you go and check them out. I don't think they've got any videos up yet, so I think this will be the first one in the Vikings Month, but as soon as they are, I'll be sharing them on my social media and in the links in the description below, so check there for the videos of Viking Month, as well as some more videos that I'll be making on the subject of the Vikings. Also, this is actually inspired by a lecture that I had last week by the brilliant Dr. Naismith, so big thank you to him. A lot of the information in this video is from that lecture, and if you're interested in this, then I'd highly recommend that you go over and you check out some of his books and articles and things that you can find online or at the library, or you can always buy them if you would like to do so. So let's get a bit theoretical, and I'm going to ask the question, what actually is money, and why do we value it so much? I mean, let's take a pound coin, for example. This is actually the old pound coin. We now have a new one in Britain, to much chagrin. But why do we appreciate money so much? Is it because it looks nice? There's a nice pattern on there, we can make little stacks of it. Or if you go to Cambridge, for example, you can put a penny in someone's drink, which means they have to down it at a formal. You can also put one in someone's dessert, but I'll let you Google what you have to do if that's the case. But no, this isn't really the reason why. The real reason why is that we can buy stuff with money. It's useful. You can buy things like food or the new album by Baldur's Draumar, Magnus. Get it? If we apply this to the early Middle Ages, we can certainly say that people were already thinking in terms of money, even if they didn't have actual physical money in the form of coins. For example, in early medieval Ireland, this basis was on slaves. Things were measured with how many slaves you could buy for a certain item, whereas in large parts of the Germanic world, this was based on cattle, which you can still see with this rune, which is feach in the Old English or the Anglo-Frisian Futhark. In the Old Norse one, so the younger Futhark, it's called fehu, and this is actually the runic symbol for both cattle and for wealth. So when I'm translating Old English, for example, and you get the word feach, you have to see if the context, it means cattle or wealth. So there's a clear connection there. And actually what's fun is that in modern languages, if you take the English word fee, it's on about a payment, whereas if you take the Dutch word fee, which is pretty much the same exact word but from another language, it is referring to animals, to cattle specifically. So one is money and the other is mui. But basically what this means is that before there were physical coins, people were still trading with each other for certain things, and this was done through barter. But as you can see from the items that I've put here, obviously you would need a lot of eggs to buy a helmet, so there are very much limits to this system of barter where it becomes very useful for one to have coins, and certainly for certain individuals. The elite, for example, who want to buy nice things like shiny belt buckles, but also for people like traders who are trading different items between different groups who would like to buy and sell them. Then it becomes very useful to have something like coins. So this leads us on to another question. If people were already thinking in terms of money, then why didn't they just use slaves or cattle as an object like coins? I mean, they had value in and of themselves. Do coins have value in and of themselves? I mean, they are made of precious metals, for example. It's certainly the case in England, where they were being made out of silver and gold. Well, the reason they're made out of precious metals is interesting, but as I explained at the start, even though they might look nice and we can stack them up and do other fun things with them, that's not really the reason why they're valuable to us. In actual fact, the precious metal compartment is more so because it's very difficult to actually acquire these resources. If coins were made out of wood, for example, anyone could carve into them with any kind of material, and they could all sort of make them and do their own thing with them, and it would lose value because of that. However, with them being made out of precious metals, these things would be hard to come by. There are no natural sources of silver or gold in England, so one had to have a significant amount of power to be able to source these materials. Another point to consider is that actually working silver and gold on the precise level and inscribing them and putting designs on them is also difficult. It requires craftspeople and people who know what they're doing. So this meant that the people who were in charge of the coinage would be the people at the top of the social structure. So these would be people like kings, for example, who could make sure that these resources were coming in from afar, and the ones who could make sure that people were actually writing on them what they wanted, as well as people in the upper echelons of the clergy. So for example, at York, we see that the archbishops there have their own coins that they mint, as well as other figures. Although this wasn't always certainly the case, certainly in the early period, we don't actually know how much the kings were involved, but essentially the precious metal compartment of the coins does mean that it has to be someone with a certain amount of clout who is making the coinage because of these reasons. And what we do actually see is that they start off making gold coins in England, but that soon this becomes debased with silver because they need more and more coins and it's harder to get gold, obviously, so they actually switch over to silver at some point. Although here it's a bit off because these are both coins from King Offa, as you can see, but King Offa was already ruling after this change from gold to silver had been accomplished, which occurred in the 7th century. So let's take a look at one of these Anglo-Saxon silver coins. Now this is one of King Offa of Mercia, who was a ruler in the 8th century. And these actually are a bit later. The earlier ones, the sceattas as they're called, are a little bit different, but I think I'll make a different video based on a lecture I actually had today with the same Dr. Rory Naismith on the earlier Anglo-Saxon coins. But if we take a look at this one, we can see some things that are quite typical of Anglo-Saxon coins from this period and later. So very often there is a bust of the king or of the figure responsible. So if it's a bishop's coin, it would be the bishop. It would be a little bit different. And this is done in the style of the Roman emperor. Now remember that Britannia had been a Roman province before, and then the Anglo-Saxons come in later on. But the Romans were very much seen as being these sort of the echelon of royal power, of authority, of societal organization. So they do copy the style of the Roman coins with the inscriptions around the outside and a bust or the head of the ruler, so in this case the Anglo-Saxon kings, in the style of the Roman emperor, almost always looking to the right as they are on Roman coins, although sometimes they do look the other way. Now these coins were made of gold or silver, as I said, and they get different names depending on what they're made of and what's inscribed on them and different types of those said branches. Now the name of the moneyer or the location of the mint is also often on the obverse of the coin, whereas you have the bust of the king on the reverse side. And this is actually very interesting because then you can trace where these coins actually came from. So one of them that I found that I have a video on at Lindisfarne, or I should say the team found, I didn't actually physically pick it out of the ground, but I was there the day that it did come out, had the name Leobench on it, and we know that Leobench was a minter at Canterbury. Now having the name of the king and of the minter or the mint location provides a certain sense of surety. It's basically the king stamping his name on it. It's a projection of authority saying, look, I'm important, because people all over the kingdom, we assume, would have, if they're from the right classes, let's say that they are a merchant or they are at a monastery or they are one of the local elite, we think that these permeated through different levels of society. It would mean that actually the king's face would be around the kingdom in a certain way. So it is certainly a projection of authority, and it provides a certain assurance that this coin is a coin that has been minted with the authority of this figure. So really it is a projection of power on the part of the person minting this coin. So these are often called today sceattas, as I said, or sceattas or sceatt. Although this is actually a modern term, back in the day they seem to refer to them as peningas, which is obviously where we get our modern term penny from. So let's take a look at Scandinavia, because in Scandinavia the economy and how money is viewed in a slightly different way. So what's there is what's called a bullion economy, and this essentially means that weight is the important factor here. So it doesn't matter if that's the weight of a coin which is being used, or of an ingot, which we actually often see being used and being cut, as I'll get into, or pieces of jewellery, things that were made of silver. Silver was the most important metal that was there, and it was the most important that was used as a kind of currency, and oftentimes this is referred to as hack silver in the context of the Vikings. So this is actually something that they picked up in the East when they were trading with the Muslims, and we know this because the Islamic caliphates there, when they first went east, this would have been the Umayyad Caliphate. Later on this became the Abbasid Caliphate, And these were highly monetized economies. They came into regions, into contact with the Sassanids, who had a highly developed currency, as well as the Byzantines. So there's a real mixing of these monetary economies that the Arabs kind of inhabit. And they had very sophisticated system with their own currency, and they used the weight as the most important factor. And this can actually be seen with their coins that they make. They also initially started making gold coins and then went over to silver coins, just the same development that occurred in Anglo-Saxon England. What's interesting is that the Arabic term mithkhalu is actually related to the word for money or for coins. And actually one mithkhalu would be equivalent to 4.25 grams. And so the Arabs used weighing scales to see that coins were actually the proper mixtures of metals, to make sure that they were weighing exactly 4.25 grams to show that this was a coin that was of the top quality, that had been minted by a royal mint, and that was therefore good to be used and could be used to purchase and to buy things with, which is essentially what merchants want, is assurance that this is a good coin, not a forgery of a coin. Now, what we see in the Viking hordes all of the time is that these are mixtures of not only coins but also random bits of silver. So oftentimes these are arm rings or ingots or bits of jewelry. And this, as I said, was called hack silver because often these have been cut into pieces. And actually one of the things I'm reading for my dissertation at the moment is about the hordes in Frisia. And the Frisian hordes are different to all the other hordes on the continent because they do indeed contain ingots and bits of hack silver, which you don't see in the Carolingian economy because, well, lo and behold, the Carolingian and Anglo-Saxon economies weren't bullion economies, so they weren't using the idea that the weight was the most important thing to decide the value of something. Now, what's interesting as well is that here in the top corner you can see that there are coins that have been cut up, and this often looks really funny to us in modern times. You wouldn't think about sawing a pound coin in half and saying, oh, it's now worth 50p, but in a bullion economy that is how it works. And the reason that they did this, if I take here an example of a coin of Eric, probably Eric Bloodaxe, unless you believe Claire Downham's theory, who ruled in York for a time, that the reason for cutting these coins can be manifold. And one of them is that half the coin obviously weighs half the weight and a full coin. So that basically means that you can pay for things that are worth less. So let's say that one coin could buy you, I'm just going to name something completely random. Let's say one coin was equivalent to one calf. If you have half a coin, then you can buy half a calf, which is a terrible example. Now, coins could also be cut very irregularly, so oftentimes they just sort of shaved chips off the side. So it wasn't that they were always cutting them lovely and in half, but rather that little bits were being taken off for very precise payments. Now, we also find lots of weighing scales, both in England and in Scandinavia, which you also see again from the Arabic side of things, that you could then weigh how much silver there was, whether this was a coin or a bit of a coin that was being weighed. You could see how much that would be worth. So there was a far greater level of trust between the merchant and the person buying things. If there was a merchant involved, we're not actually sure if it was always merchants. These could just have been normal people who would have a set of weighing scales, because then they could trust that the item they were being given, the silver or the silver content, was there and that it was therefore a valid transaction. Again, this is much more based on the personal trust rather than in Anglo-Saxon England, where you had this idea of the name of the authority of the minter and of the monarch or the person in charge who was minting these coins. Now, the interesting thing is that the Anglo-Saxons actually start to cut up coins as well, but this occurs in the 970s. And what's different is that in the 970s, often we think when they start cutting coins, the first instinct might be that this is because they've learned from the Scandinavians. But remember, by the 970s, the Scandinavians had already been in England in potentially large numbers, but certainly with great cultural contact on the north and in the east, that they had already been there for a century. So why would we only see this now? Perhaps it's better to view it in the coinage reforms, which occurred in 973 under the reign of King Edgar, which is when the coinage becomes standardized and you'd get reissuing of the coinage as well. Another thing we can infer is that perhaps England is becoming increasingly monetized systematized at this point, that there are more coins in circulation, which from an archaeological record of a little bit later certainly seems to be the case, which is something I'll get onto in a second. And also that people were using coins to buy different and more things. Because if you think that a coin, and we think, although we have no exact data on this, that one such coin would be worth tens of modern pounds or dollars or euros or so on. And so that if you're then cutting them into halves and quarters, you're trying to buy things that are worth smaller amounts. Because of course, for a small purchase for the average person, you're not going to be spending tens of pounds at once. So you want to have a smaller amount. And actually in London, we do find coins that are minted with the specific idea. They mint them smaller so that they are worth about half of what's in another coin. But remember, for the Anglo-Saxons, this wasn't about weight. This was about the value rather than the weight, as it was for the Scandinavians. And this is also why in Anglo-Saxon England you never find the kind of chipped coins as you do with the Scandinavians. Or, well, you do, but then this is in a Scandinavian context. Instead, these cuttings would be cuttings that are done exactly half or exactly a quarter of the coin. And as you can see actually on this coin, the long cross that cuts the coin into quarters might actually be there for the very purpose of being able to cut the coin into quarters and so getting smaller amounts from it. And this is actually something very interesting that is a distinction between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, is that they both end up doing the same thing. They both end up cutting up their coins, but the reasons for doing it are different. The Vikings, of course, with the idea of the bullion economy, that the weight is the most important thing, so they're trying to change the weight of the coin by cutting them up, whereas the Anglo-Saxons are trying to change the value of the coin by cutting them up, that it's symbolic of being half the coin that you have, and so you can get half of the goods that you want to get with it. Of course, it has the same outcome because half of the coin for the Vikings weighs half as much as the full coin, but it's interesting that there's a difference between the two and whether these influenced each other in England or not. Now, what's interesting as well is that in the 10th century, actually, this great supply of silver that came into Scandinavia and other parts of Europe, but mainly into Scandinavia from the east in the form of Arabic dirhams, it starts to dry up. And the reason for this is that the mountains, the silver mine in Afghanistan dried up, and so their source of silver they no longer had access to. So they had to start debasing the coins, which is essentially, they were still minting coins because their economy required it, but they couldn't put the right amount of silver in, so they started to mix it up with other metals. And actually we found from archaeological records of the dirhams from the 10th century onward that the late 8th century dirhams were really pure. They were 90% silver, so they were really beautiful shiny coins. But by the 11th century they were just 5% silver. And for people who were so aware with the weights and the weighing scales, and we hear stories, for example, that one of the Icelandic retainers, I believe it's in Heimskringla, sort of goes off on one at King Harald Hardrada because he debases the coinage and he can tell, and he says these coins are worth nothing and throws them on the floor and storms out, which is typical of Icelanders because the Icelanders were writing the stories, so their ancestors are always very ballsy in front of the Norwegian kings. But it does show that people were very much aware of what was going on with the currency, with the economy, with debasement of coins and their value. And this perhaps is also interesting because it's around this time, the early 11th century, the late 10th century, that real Viking raids on England change in character. You get these really large, actually royally led by characters like Svein Folkbeard, Olaf Tryggvason and Knut, of course, who come over to England and fight in great battles, and are then paid what's called Danegeld, although this was actually a term never used by the Anglo-Saxons for this payment. They usually refer to it as a kind of a javel, which is a sort of tribute, or a herregeld, which is an army money, essentially. But it's where they pay huge amounts of silver to the Vikings, because of course the Anglo-Saxons were producing lots and lots of coins at the time. And of course this is also when you get the invasion of England by the Danes in 1016 with King Knut coming over and eventually becoming king there. Because of the lack of silver coming from the east, they then had to get a new source of silver because their economies were so based on silver and the power that it gave, that kings actually sent these whole organized Viking fleets with the goal of then getting all the silver from essentially being paid to leave and then coming back again and again. Alright, so those are some things I wanted to mention about Anglo-Saxon and Viking coins and how they used coins and essentially the economy and how they viewed this in a different way, because I thought that is a very interesting period of study to look at how they were using these. This is also a little meme that I made a while back, which you might have picked up on in the video, is that there seems to be some very poor attempt at Arabic on an Anglo-Saxon coin. Now, does this mean that the Anglo-Saxons were Muslim and we need to rewrite history? Definitely not, but there is actually a very funny story behind this. So if you want a video on coin imitation and why on earth the Anglo-Saxons of Mercia were trying to copy this Arabic dinar, then let me know in the comments below. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. We have come to the end. This has become a much longer video than I anticipated, but there was a lot of food for thought in that lecture and also the one this morning, so I thought I'd treat you guys to a nice Wednesday video. I'm actually recording this on Wednesday, so this has been recorded today, so I hope you do all enjoy this video. I'm going to set this to render now as soon as I have done the outro bit here, and I hope you'll tune in again on Friday. I'm going to make some more videos about the Vikings for Viking Month, so I'd highly recommend you check out History Time and History of Vikings and any other channels that are getting involved. I'll link them all below and you'll see more of me talking about Vikings in the future. So thank you very much. I have been Hilbert and this has been The History. Don't forget to have an awesome day.